Morning, everybody. Can I share with you guys an interesting fact? You know the one team that is always present at the Super Bowl? It's the Green Bay Packers. And you know why? Because if you win, you know what you get? The Lombardi Trophy, which happens to be named after the legendary Green Bay Packers coach, Vince Lombardi. So I represent the Packers because we are always represented at the Super Bowl, no matter what. So I'm not going to ask who you're rooting for because I heard the boos at the beginning, and I don't want that kind of negativity at this point in our gathering. But I hope you have a good day. I hope you have fun celebrating, watching. I hope your team wins, and you have a great, great day today. Anyway, today, here, as we've gathered, we are continuing kind of this journey we're at through the first part of the book of Genesis. Genesis is the first book in the Old Testament, the first part of the Bible. And when you look at the whole story of the Bible, like the larger picture of the Bible, it's a story of God's mission in the world with his people. First of all, in the Old Testament, his people is the nation of Israel, and then out of Israel, out of kind of the fall of Israel in the New Testament, the church emerges from the remnant of Israel. And so that's really the story of the Bible, is God's mission with his people throughout history. But the first part of Genesis, and the reason why we're looking at it, is Genesis 1 through 11 is oftentimes what's called prehistory. And Genesis 1 through 11 is universal. It's not focusing in on Israel. It's not focusing in on the church. It's focusing in on the world in general and kind of asking the question, how did we get here? Why is God even on a mission? What is this all about? How did the world get to the way the world is, and what is it that God is up to? And so when you look at Genesis 1 starts with creation, that God created everything. And there's this diagram, if you've been here, that I've kind of been showing you every week, but it's this kind of creation diagram, that God created this dynamic creation, and that he didn't create it to be stable. He created it to go somewhere. He created it to grow. He created it to flourish. And in that original creation, there's God, there's humanity, there's physical creation. And when those things are living in right relationship with one another, it leads to shalom, the Hebrew word for peace. It leads to kind of thriving and flourishing. But what we've seen is that starting in Genesis 3, that shalom kind of falls apart. And really creation begins to sort of spiral out of control because all of these things happen that really break apart the relationship between God, humanity, and creation. And so here's this next one. Here's some of the events that we have been looking at as you follow the first part of Genesis. You start off, you have creation, and God creates that everything, but then things don't go well in the Garden of Eden. Adam and Eve kind of push God to the side. They make God really an object. They try to live apart from him. That all kind of falls apart. They're expelled from the garden. Then it gets worse with their kids because their kids turn on each other. One murders the other, and things start to go really bad with Cain and Abel. Then last week, Jericho did a phenomenal job of walking us through the Noah story and the flood story. And in that story, it's not just two people that turn on each other. It's all of humanity that kind of turns on each other. And so everything just begins to really spiral out of control. And we have a little bit more to go before we begin to see, hey, here's what God's going to do now to rescue this whole thing. And so where we are now is, hey, everything, like all this stuff is kind of spiraled out of control. You had this flood story, and then after the Noah and flood story picks up, you get into Genesis chapter 10, which, if you read through the first part of Genesis, Genesis chapter 10 is absolutely the most boring part of it. Because Genesis chapter 10 it's this genealogy. It's kind of this family line of Noah's the main character in the flood story, but Genesis 10 follows his sons. And it becomes the genealogy of his sons and how his sons really kind of have their own families and how they spread out and how the human population is really spreading out. Genesis 10:32 actually kind of sums it up. It says, "These are the clans of Noah's sons according to their lines of descent within their nations. From these, the nations spread out over the earth after the flood." And so what you have in Genesis 10, oftentimes it's called the table of nations sometimes, but it's this, hey, these people went here, and this nation came about, and these people went here, and this nation came about, and it's the line of Noah's sons, Japheth, Ham, and Shem. And as boring as it may be, it's actually pretty significant what is being told, because what is being told is it's painting a picture or giving us a map of the nations that were emerging. Like it's giving us a map politically and territorially of all these nations that are showing. And it covers an area that includes parts of Asia, parts of Africa, and parts of Europe. Now, it centers around the land of Canaan, what you and I know as Israel and the Palestinian territories, which is eventually where the people of Israel will live. But at this point, Israel's not a nation. And so these expanding nations all kind of center around the central part of the land, which makes sense because Genesis is Israel's text. Israel's going to be front and center pretty soon, but they're not yet. So it's just kind of following, hey, here's how the nations around this area are growing and they're expanding. And it describes the realities that are emerging both kind of politically and territorially. And in Genesis 10, this is a good thing. What's happening, the expansion from Noah's sons to all these different now peoples and nations and tribes that are emerging is a good thing. It's part of God's command. God's original command to human beings was to fill the earth and subdue it. So that's exactly what's happening. You have these people that are moving out and they're filling the earth and they're subduing it. They're organizing it. They're organizing it in a way that people can be cared for, that things can be provided for, that there can be some structure. So as we're growing and as we're expanding, we're doing it in a helpful, productive way. Now, one of the things that's really fascinating about Genesis 10 is in the ancient world, Genesis 10, actually what Genesis 10 is telling us actually stands in stark contrast to what most other nations said about the origin of different people groups and where they came from. All ancient civilizations had some story about where they came from, why they emerged. And typically, your story had something to do with the effect that your god or your goddesses or your gods or whoever your deities were, that they created the world and they created you first and you were best. And so your origin story is really rooted in why we're better than everyone else because we were first. And what's fascinating is the early part of Genesis is the origin story of Israel, right? Guess who's not mentioned anywhere in Genesis 10? Israel. They don't exist yet. They weren't created as better than anyone else. They weren't first. In fact, Israel is a later addition. Israel is something that emerges in response to what is happening. And so in this kind of origin story of where all of these nations came from, what Genesis is saying is that, hey, all of these nations are good. And God doesn't like any one nation better than any other nation. It's not like God says, hey, this is mine, I like them better. No, all of these nations expanding, filling, subduing, this is all a good thing. Now, the other thing it does is most ancient nations, when they had their origin story of where they came from, part of their origin story was a justification of really their royal line and of their existing political structures. Right? Why does this person rule us? Why does this family rule us? Why do these people rule us? And why do they rule us in the way they do? Because this is what the gods wanted. And so your theology would really kind of justify your political and your royal structures. But what Genesis 10 says is Genesis 10 says, no, actually how you organize socially, which is ultimately what politics is, right? It's how we organize socially. How you organize socially is really a human thing. That God's not justifying this or that God's saying, no, this is part of the human vocation. Part of the human vocation to fill and subdue the earth is to figure out how do we organize socially in a way that is good and right, that ultimately leads to human flourishing. So that the gods or gods don't justify some oppressive system, that it's a human innovation, that we are actually as people, part of our job as image bearers, people who are created in the image of God, is to create a society that leads to flourishing, that is just and that is right and that is us. It's not God dictating, saying this is what you do, this is how it has to be. No, that is part of our job. That's part of what it means to be human. And the other thing Genesis 10 does is Genesis 10 kind of like centralizes this idea of the interconnectedness of people. Is you have all of these nations that are emerging in these different places, and they have these different social realities, but they're all still connected. That the key to flourishing and thriving is in the interconnectedness of all of these different peoples. We're not isolated from one another. That we may be separated geographically and politically from over here, but human flourishing and thriving is dependent upon all of us. That ultimately, if we're going to live in that shalom that God created, that God intended, then we're going to have to learn how do we do that together, even as we're growing, even as we're expanding. So Genesis 10 is actually really seemingly the first time in the early story of Genesis that things seem to be going well. That you had Adam and Eve in the garden, that went bad. You had Cain and Abel, that went bad. You had Noah in the flood, that went bad. So there's kind of this reset after the flood story. And now in Genesis 10, hey, it seems to be going well. Humanity is actually filling the earth. They're subduing it. This seems to be good. It seems to be headed on the right track, which is why when you get to Genesis 11 is a bit of a shock and a surprise, because guess what? It goes bad again. In Genesis 10, everything seems to be lining up that finally we're going to get it right, and finally this is going to be good. But in Genesis 11, it kind of continues that downward trajectory of the first part of Genesis. So here's what happens. Genesis 11, verse 1. Now the whole world had one language and a common speech. As people moved eastward, they found a plain in Shinar, and they settled there. They said to each other, "Come, let's make bricks and bake them thoroughly." They used brick instead of stone and tar for mortar. Then they said, "Come, let us build ourselves a city with a tower that reaches to the heavens, so that we may make a name for ourselves. Otherwise, we will be scattered over the face of the whole earth." So in this point, a significant transition is made. Right? Genesis 10 is talking about people are expanding, and they're moving, and they're filling, and they're subduing. But what happens in Genesis 11 is, hey, let's make bricks and let's bake them thoroughly. That is a major transition, because when you are a nomadic people, a people that are moving, that are expanding, you live in tents. Why? Because you have to take them down and then you have to put them back up, and they're easy to transport. So the fact that they start making bricks shows this is a transition from nomads to settlers, because bricks are not temporary structures. These are permanent structures. We're going to put down roots. We're going to stay here. So this is a major transition in humanity of we're no longer going to fill and subdue. We're going to stop and we're going to centralize. And what we're going to see is that what they're doing actually becomes in opposition to what God told them to do. Remember, God told them, fill and subdue. We feel like we've filled enough, so we're going to stop here, we're going to settle down, we're going to put down roots, and we're going to begin to build these permanent structures. Where they end up stopping, the location that's given to us, is actually the future site of the city of Babylon, which is, if you're familiar with ancient history at all, Babylon, the Babylonian Empire, becomes a major, major player. It's in modern-day Iraq is where it's in, kind of like what's a lot of times called the cradle of civilization, right in there. And we're told the reason that they stop, the reason that they say we need to stop, we need to make bricks, we need to build these cities and these permanent structures, is because they do not want to be scattered. That's what I said. If we don't do this, we're going to be scattered all over the place. So let's do this so we can centralize. Again, that decision is in direct opposition to what God instructed them to do. God said, here's what I'm doing. I'm putting you here. I want you to fill and subdue. And so go, fill and subdue, and go. They say, no, we're going to stop, and we are going to centralize. And the reason for their centralization, there's actually two reasons. The reasons are fear and pride. That's what they say, right? If we don't do this, we're going to be scattered all over the place, and we're going to lose our centrality, so we need to stay together. The other thing is we want to make a name for ourselves. So how do we make a name for ourselves? By doing something great, by achieving something great, by having this giant monument that we ourselves constructed. And so what's important to understand is we're going to see this story about this building and this tower and what's happening here. It's not at all a critique against human achievement. It's not at all a critique against building cities or building towers or any of that. The problem here is what human beings are doing. First of all, it's just anti-God. They're going against what God created them to do. And secondly, what they're doing out of fear and out of pride. And whenever you do things, whenever you build systems and structures and societies and social realities on fear and pride, it will always lead to oppression every single time. So they're trying to build this world that is anti-God and is built on human fear and on human pride. But they're kind of shrouding it in, well, it's really about achievement. We're going to build this thing as this great achievement. And so the problem isn't the tower, it's that. It's anti-God, it's fear, it's pride. This is going to become oppressive if it's allowed to continue. And so what they decide to build is this giant tower. Now, one of the things eventually that Babylon will become famous for is they have this big tower that's called a ziggurat, I think is how you say it. Here's a kind of a drawing, a rendering of what these look like. Now, Babylon isn't the only place that has these. They're actually all over this part of the ancient world. They would build these big towers, and typically, again, you can kind of see it was a tiered thing where you had these like rectangular tiers, one on top of the other. And in this image, it kind of shows they're constructing it. You can kind of see it on the top. The top of a ziggurat, these big towers, was typically a temple. And the reason for that is that when you performed sacrifices or rituals or whatever your worship was, is because you were higher up, you were closer to the gods or goddesses. And so it was easier for them to receive your offering and your sacrifice and your worship. The other thing is ancient people actually believed that the gods would use these big towers to come down to the earth. It was like a staircase. If you're familiar at all like with Greek mythology where the gods would come down from Mount Olympus and interact with people, that's the view that people had of ancient gods and goddesses. And so the ziggurats are where they would come down to the earth. And so these are really important structures that they would put in the middle of these cities. You and I, because we come from like a Western secular perspective, we may read the story of Genesis 11 here in the building of this tower from a secular perspective, like somehow they're trying to escape the gods, or this is about doing away with the gods. These people were incredibly religious. In the ancient world, all civilizations were religious. They worshiped different gods, they worshiped different goddesses. So the issue is not there's no gods or goddesses. The issue is, how do we manipulate the gods and goddesses? How do we protect ourselves from the fickle nature of the gods and goddesses? Because people believe the gods and goddesses were fickle, and if they didn't like you, they'd destroy you, they'd wipe you out, they'd curse your crops, whatever. How do we protect ourselves from their fickle nature, and how do we manipulate them to get what we want from them? So it's this, how do we protect ourselves to secure our own way of life and what we want and what it is that we're after? So this is what's happening when these people decide to centralize and let's build this tower. Let's build this reality. Let's build this world that is anti-God, that is rooted in human fear and pride. That's the first. So the first part of the story in Genesis 11 is here's what human beings are doing. The second part of the story is going to be, now how does God respond? How is God going to respond to what human beings choose to do? Verse 5 of Genesis 11. But the Lord came down to see the city and the tower the people were building. The Lord said, if as one people speaking the same language they have begun to do this, then nothing they plan to do will be impossible for them. Come, let us go down and confuse their language so they will not understand each other. So the Lord scattered them from there over the whole earth, and they stopped building the city. That is why it's called Babel, because there the Lord confused the language of the whole earth. From there the Lord scattered them over the face of the whole earth. I grew up in church, and they used to tell me the story was called the Tower of Babel. But what I learned from scholars and what I learned from the online dictionary and what I learned from Mumford & Sons is that you actually pronounce it Babel. So that's why I said it that way. I may go back and forth because, for most of my life I said Babel. But anyway, Babel it sounds like the Hebrew word for confusion. That's where that name comes from, because this is where God confuses everything. Now, my favorite line in that is actually the first line, because the first line is incredibly sarcastic. Sometimes we don't give the biblical writers enough credit that they're actually intelligent, kind of funny, and sometimes they throw in these little digs. Because remember what the people said? They said, we need to build this tower to the heavens so that we can get to heavens on the own, that we can achieve this godlike status. So they build this big tower, and the first thing that God does is God has to come down to see their tower. Because as high as you built it, guess what? Still not high enough. I still have to come down to be able to see it. And so God comes down and he sees this tower and he sees what's going on. And the focus of the story, the focus of it is really on language. That's kind of what's at stake here. That's what God sees. That's what he realizes. That's ultimately what happens, is the division of all these different languages. And the reason why language is central to this is because language is key to human community. Language shapes cultures and realities. And the thing about language, and you and I know this, is language is incredibly powerful. And language can be used for both good and for evil. Language is what helps us build trust. Language is what helps us build these loving, thriving relationships. Language also is what propaganda is rooted in. And language leads to lies. And so language is this incredibly powerful thing that allows us to do good things, it allows us to do bad things. And what God understands is the tower that's being built here, it's not just being built with brick and mortar, it's being built with language. It's being built with words. It's being built with ideas, with concepts of who we are, of who we can become, of what we can do. Language is the force behind this anti-God, fear and prideful world that people are trying to build. That's what's at the heart of it. That's what brings it all together. That's what makes all of it possible. And so when God comes down, the first thing we're told that he does is that he confuses language. Unable to communicate now, these people, they stop building because they can no longer build this world that they have dreamed in their minds that they want to build because they can't communicate. They can't share these ideas. They can't come together. And so the building stops. And as a result, the people then are scattered all over the earth, which is exactly what God intended in the first place. Fill and subdue. And so when you read it, sometimes it can seem really harsh, like God's reaction, like these people are just building a building. Let them build a building. But you have to remember what's at stake and what's happening. And ultimately, what happens as a result. The end of this story is that humanity is scattered. They're scattered to do what? Exactly what they were created to do. To fill and subdue the earth. Walter Brueggemann, who's an Old Testament scholar, when he talks about this story, he describes the world that people are trying to build with the tower and the city as a self-made world that is ultimately a fortress from God. How do we build a world? How do we build a reality that is our reality that protects us and keeps us safe from any outside forces? We're going to acknowledge that the forces are there. We're going to acknowledge that the forces are real, but we don't want to be at their whim. We want to have some amount of buffer. We want to have some amount of control and protection. So how do we build this self-made world that insulates us and keeps us safe no matter what happens? And so again, it's not this story that's anti-achievement, it's not this story that's anti-technology or cities, or it's not against cooperation at all. It's a story that is against human self-sufficiency and autonomy. It's a story that is against any effort to build a world that is apart from God, because any attempt to do so will ultimately lead to destruction and oppression. See, what God wants, what God creates, if you go back to that triangle diagram, what God wants is a flourishing, thriving creation. Where humanity and physical creation and God, where they live in right relationship with one another, and when they live in right relationship, there's flourishing, there's thriving, there's shalom, and there's peace. What's happening in Genesis 11 is we're trying to build this autonomous, anti-God world that is rooted in pride and fear that ultimately becomes what? Oppressive and destructive, which is where we're at. See, God wants flourishing and thriving. He wants achievement. He wants progress, but not through manipulation, not through coercion, not through power, not through fear, not through pride. And so the result of the tower story is that people are scattered and they continue to fill and subdue and attempt to live out the original human vocation. Now, one of the questions that this story in Genesis 11 raises, which is a very profound question, is, okay, if Genesis 11 is an example, if it is an example of like an attempt to bring people together, but an attempt to bring people together that is rooted in fear and pride, that's destructive, which I think most of us would agree, those are not good unifying factors. They're kind of effective at times. It's easy to bring people together around fear. It's easy to bring people together around pride, but it doesn't lead to good things. It always leads to oppression. And it raises the question of, how do you bring people together? And more specifically, because Genesis 10 is talking about, hey, people are moving out, and then you get to the tower, and after the tower, people continue to move out. The question that you and I have to face is, okay, how do you bring people together who are now becoming more and more diverse? Right, that's the issue that the building of the tower is trying to do, is the people build the tower because they realize we're spreading out too much. We're becoming too diverse. How do we stay together? This is how we stay together, and God kind of busts that whole thing open, and so they continue to spread out. And the question now is, well, how do you have unity among diversity? If unity is a good thing, if people being together is a good thing, God's not against unity. He's against unity that's rooted in the wrong things. So how do you build healthy unity among diversity. See, because we live and exist in the United States, we tend to come at this from a democratic point of view. In that what we've all been taught and the system that we've created structurally within our nation is the way you have unity among diversity is majority rules. Right, that's what you do. The majority rules and the rest of us just kind of live with it. So whether or not it happens the way you want it to happen, the majority has the say, and once the majority makes a decision, then the rest of us just go along with it. Now, that is effective for producing results, but it's not necessarily right. And the one thing it doesn't do is it doesn't deal with emotions. It doesn't resolve emotions. Booker T. Washington gave this great quote, maybe you've heard of it. I love it. He says, "A lie doesn't become truth, wrong doesn't become right, and evil doesn't become good just because it's accepted by a majority." So the whole idea that like majority is going to be right, that's not always true. But I think probably more significant to us is what majority rules doesn't do is it doesn't resolve our emotions. See, as people, as a nation, we have always disagreed with one another. Always. You go back to the founders of our nation, there's always been disagreement over what we should do. But what seems to be escalating more and more recently is the emotional aspect of it. Because all of these disagreements we have about what should be done in our world, what should be done in our culture, what they produce in us is they end up producing these emotions. And there's anger, and there's hurt, and there's pain. And so, yeah, the democratic reality will lead us to, hey, it produces this certain result, right? Here's the result. People voted, here's the result. Okay, here's what it is. But these emotions continue to linger. And the emotions are actually what keep us from being united, right? My anger toward you, my hurt from you, my resentment from you. That's what keeps us, that's what drives us further and further apart. It's not really what we think, it's what we feel. And the thing about media, I don't care what media you consume, all media in our culture is emotionally manipulative. It is designed not to give you information, it is designed to make you feel certain things about certain people, and that just raises everything, it blows up the emotions, and it pushes us further and further apart. A couple weeks ago, I shared with you that last summer, I sat down with a group of four people who were super involved in our church prior to the whole kind of COVID experience. And then at different points throughout the COVID experience, they left the church. And so I wanted to understand, like, why? Why did you leave? Well, and so I reached out to them, and we all sat down. We met at Panera Bread, and the five of us sat down, and I just asked them questions. I knew what the COVID experience was like for me, and it was an absolute disaster, but I wanted to hear what it was like for them. But I knew going into this, they were going to say things that were going to make me mad. They were going to say things that were going to tick me off. They were going to say things that not only did I sharply disagree with, but I felt like were probably anti-Jesus and anti-God and anti-the gospel. And likewise, they had their own hurt and their own pain and their own emotions. Because this was their church, and they loved it, and something about it hurt them or betrayed them. And it was painful for them to leave. They described it like a divorce. A lot of these people had been a part of this church longer than I have. And so going into that, you just know, hey, this isn't just this discussion over disagreement. There's going to be a lot of emotions behind this. There's going to be a lot of feelings. And so what I had committed to do in the beginning is I'm like, you know what? I'm going to listen. I'm not going to get defensive. I'm not going to reply. I'm just going to listen. And I told them that from the very beginning. I said, listen, I'm just here. I want to listen and I want to understand to the best that I can. So I'm not going to say anything. I said, if you want to ask me questions at the end, I will gladly answer questions. But right now, I'm just going to listen. So I sat there and I listened. And as I listened, I was hurt. And I was angry. And I was upset. And I was incredibly emotional. And you know what? They were emotional too. They were hurt, and they were angry, and they were upset. And the question is, when you sit down with people that you disagree with, and there's all these emotions that go both ways, what do you do with those emotions? Where do they go? And so what I decided to do, hear me out on this, especially if you're a therapist, I'm not saying this is healthy. I'm not saying this is healthy at all. I'm just telling you this is what I did. I decided for that conversation that I would become a container. That I would take all of those emotions, their emotions, my emotions, and I would hold them. Usually what we do is we pass them back. You give me emotions, I give you an increased version of whatever it is you give me. And that's how they build, and that's how we end up where we are. So I decided I'm going to be a container, and all their emotions and all my emotions, I am going to absorb them. And I'm going to hold on to them. And that's going to keep this from actually blowing up. It's going to keep this from being this super destructive thing. It's going to allow us to hopefully work through this and come to a better place, which ended up happening. But I decided I was going to become a container in that moment. Now, as human beings, okay, we can do that sometimes in meaningful relationships. Parents, sometimes you become a container for your children's emotions. Spouses, sometimes we become a container for our spouse's emotions. But again, as any therapist worth their salt will probably tell you, it's not a good way to live. You can't contain that forever. I have enough problem containing my own emotions, so if I have to hold your emotions too, this becomes really destructive. This is a big part of the reason I winded up back in therapy. To work through all of these internal emotions. But the point is that emotions have to go somewhere. And see, our emotions, here's the thing, our emotions, where they come from, is they're rooted in this reality that we want things to be right. We want the world to be just. We want things to be the way they should be. And the reason we have all these different emotions is because things aren't how we want them to be. And I'm mad at you because you're advocating something that's going to make the world not how I want it to be. Or I'm mad at you because you're not giving me what it is that I want from you. We get mad at each other, and it's rooted in these emotions because we want things to be right. We want the world to be the way that it should be. We want things to be just, and we get mad, and we get angry, and we get hurt because things aren't the way they should be. And there's all of these emotions, and those emotions have to go somewhere. They have to go somewhere. And typically, we just end up throwing them on each other. Here they go, here they go. We become these containers, but we don't want to be containers, so we just end up throwing them back on each other. See, it's not the disagreements that keep us from having unity among diversity. It's the emotions that keep us from having unity among diversity. Our fear, our anger, our resentment, our anxiety, our hurt, that all has to go somewhere. So where does it go? If you fast forward to the book of Acts, Acts is in the New Testament. Acts picks up after the life, death, resurrection, and ascension of Jesus. Jesus is resurrected. He's ascended to heaven. His followers are claiming that he is now the true Lord. He's Lord over everything. Right? That Caesar is not Lord, that Jesus is Lord over all of heaven and all of earth. He has all authority over everything because of his resurrection and ascension. And so in Acts 2 is when the church begins. It begins at the day of Pentecost, which is a Jewish holiday. People of Jews from all over the world have gathered, Jews who speak all different kinds of languages. And here's what Acts 2, 5 through 6 says. Acts 2, 5 through 6 says, "Now there were staying in Jerusalem God-fearing Jews from every nation under heaven. When they heard this sound, a crowd came together in bewilderment because each one heard their own language being spoken." So you have this gathering of Jews that's come for Pentecost, which is a harvest festival, and they're there to celebrate this festival. And they all speak all these different languages, and people begin to stand up and to proclaim about Jesus' death and resurrection. And what happens in that moment is a complete reversal of the Babel story. Because what happens at Babel is people come together rooted in fear and pride, and let's build this anti-God world, and they end up scattered and divided. So what happens now in Acts 2 in Pentecost is you have all these scattered, divided people who have come together. And now they're brought together through what? Jesus. The death and resurrection of Jesus. See, in Jesus, God is bringing together what has been divided. And Paul, the Apostle Paul, kind of explains how this works. Here's what he says, Ephesians, a letter he writes to the church in Ephesus. Here's what he says in Ephesians 2. He says, "But now, in Christ Jesus, you once who were far away have been brought near by the blood of Christ. For he himself is our peace, who has made the two groups one and has destroyed the barrier, the dividing wall of hostility, by setting aside in his flesh the law with its commandments and regulations. His purpose was to create in himself one new humanity out of the two, thus making peace. And here's the point that Paul makes. This is a powerful point. See, Paul in other places, like in Corinthians, will talk about how Jesus is the way that God is reconciling us to himself. Right? You go back to that triangle diagram, like those relationships fall apart. Jesus' death and resurrection is the means by which God is reconciling us to himself and restoring that and making that right. But Paul also says here, he says you have to understand that Jesus is also the means by which you and I are reconciled to one another. That Jesus becomes our peace. That his death and resurrection isn't just about us and God, it's about you and me. And how does that work? It works because what happens is that Jesus becomes the container. He becomes the container that holds all that. And here's how that works. It's not just like a lame little thing you say, like, oh, I'm going to give it to Jesus. Here's how it actually works. Remember what our emotions are rooted in. Our emotions are rooted in the fact that the world is not right, that things aren't the way they should be. This relationship isn't the way it should be. Work isn't the way it should be. The world isn't the way it should be. Society isn't the way it should be. The state, the nation, the city isn't the way it should be. And so we get angry because we want to make things the way that we want them to be. We want them to be right. Jesus comes along as the Messiah of Israel and says, I am making the world right. See, we live in this Western society that long held has been this belief that we can create utopia on earth. We call it the myth of progress. We keep progressing, and we'll get there, and we'll get there. Part of the despair, I think, that's spreading throughout our culture and our society is we're slowly beginning to realize that's never going to happen. We're not ever going to get there. We're not ever going to create utopia on earth. We will always fall short. Now, that does not mean we should stop working toward progress. That doesn't, especially as a church, especially as Christians, we should be working toward creating a more just society for everyone in that society. But the reality is, we're never going to get there. It's never going to be the way it should be until Jesus finishes his work. Until he makes all things right. Until he brings everything back together. Until he makes all things new. And so what happens is, okay, you and I have disagreements. You and I have differences, right? No matter what our relationship is. We're good friends, we're coworkers, we're just citizens in the same city. We have this should be this way, this should be that way. If my hope for the world is rooted in I have to make everything right, then I'm always going to be angry at you, and I'm always going to be hurt by you, and you're never going to be enough for me, and you're never going to give me what I want. And this is why we act like when things don't go our way, it's the end. The end is here because it's not happening how I want it to happen. Look, everything's falling apart. We did a series in the fall in Revelation. You know what Revelation says? You know who decides the end? Jesus. Jesus decides the end. You and I don't, neither does anyone else. He does. Jesus is making the world right. And if I can live by that, if I can live with this confidence that, you know what? I'm going to do the best that I can, but it's Jesus who's making things right. It's Jesus who's going to make the world right. And so you know what? If I don't get my way in this relationship, if I don't get my way in this city, that's okay. Because what I can do is I can take my anger and I can take my resentment and I can take my bitterness and I can say, Jesus, I didn't get what I wanted. I don't think things are the way that they should be. But I trust that you will do what is right. And I trust that you will make things right. And so I'm going to put that in you. And I'm going to let go of that. And it's not abandoning hope. It's recognizing where my hope comes from. See, at the end of the day, here's the question. Do you believe? Do I trust God to make the world right? Do I trust him to make the world right? Because if I trust him to make the world right, I don't have to let my emotions control me. We don't have to live in this constantly divided world. We don't have to live in this world where we're trying to make things right based on our own achievement, where we're trying to make things right rooted in our own pride and in our own fear. See, part of the reason I believe that the local church is the hope of the world is because we have the one thing to offer our world that it desperately needs. We have a way to be united, even in the midst of diversity. We have a way to stand together, to serve together, to worship together, to be together, to live in healthy relationships with one another, even when we disagree. Because at the end of the day, it's not us who makes the world right. It's God. And we take our emotions, we take our anger, we take our hurt, we take our frustration, we place it onto Jesus in the cross, and we let him carry it, knowing that he is making the world right. He will decide the end, and in the end, he will make all things right. So I do what I can, but ultimately, I trust in him and in the world that he is making, the new creation that he is making, that we get to take a part of. But it's his. Because he's the only one that's big enough to carry all of that stuff that you and I carry around. And when we allow him to carry it, then we can build a flourishing, thriving, united world under the lordship of Jesus Christ. Let me pray. Father, I thank you for your love for us. I thank you that you came down to this earth in the person of Jesus. You lived, you died, you rose again, and you ascended into heaven, and you are making all things new. And God, help us to trust in that. That this world will never be what we want it to be. It will never be what we hope it will be. God, we can make progress. God, we can make things better. We can work toward justice. We can work toward righteousness. And we always should. That is a part of our human vocation. It's a part of what it means to be made in your image. It's a part of what it means to be redeemed. It's a part of what it means to be Christian. But also, we will always fall short. And when we fall short, when that gap between what we work for and what we want, when that gap comes along, God, that's where our emotions kick in. That's where anger and fear and frustration and pride, that's where all that stuff kicks in. And Father, our hope is that rather than let that build, rather than let that bounce back and forth between one another, that we can take all of that and we can surrender it to you. Not in some cheesy passive way, God, but in a real act of surrender where we say, this isn't what I want, this isn't what I hoped for, this isn't what I think is right. But God, I trust you. I trust you to make all things right. I trust you to do what is good. And so I can still love, and I can still serve, and I can still hope, and I can still give, and I can still live. Because I trust you to make all things right. God, we love you, we thank you, we pray all this in Jesus' name. Amen.